Hey everyone, Sycra here, and in this tutorial I want to talk about RGB color sliders and why I think it's useful to know this, know how to use them, and why I think it helps when digital painting. Now of course you don't need to use them, and if you already know how to use RGB sliders and this tutorial isn't for you, but this is more for people who aren't used to RGB sliders and don't really know how to use them, because it is kind of complicated. So what do I mean by RGB sliders? Well, if you're using Photoshop and you go to Window and Color, this thing pops up and it's the color sliders. And the default is set at HSB, which stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. So hue is like what the color of a thing is, right? Like, is it red? Is it orange? Is it yellow? Saturation is how intense that is. Is it a very vivid, in this case green, or is it like a very dull green? And you go more and more desaturated until you get to gray. And brightness is how bright that is. Is it like really bright or is it really dark? But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about RGB sliders. So RGB sliders, if you don't have this and you open up color in Photoshop, you click here and there's a bunch of different panels, and you click on RGB sliders and you get something like this. Now if you're using a program like Coloris, you'll have sliders available like the RGB ones here, and this has hue, saturation, and value, and other ones. So we're talking about RGB. So RGB, if you haven't noticed, stands for red, green, and blue. And basically you use red, green, and blue in varying degrees to make your colors. Now, why is that something you want to know? What is this good for? Well, for me, it actually really helps in making sure my colors are more accurate and that they are less muddy. Often with hue, saturation, and value, you end up with very muddy colors. Now I have a bunch of different videos on different coloring techniques. You know, you could use the color wheel, which I like to use as well. But RGB is special because this is something that is uniquely digital, and it actually functions the way light does. So it's an additive coloring method, first of all. So additive is when you take light and you add it on top of each other to make colors. So let's make a layer, and I guess it's like screen. So if I put like a green, no, I have to put a gray on the background first. It's not going to show up. Okay, if I put like a green here, and then I put a blue here, oops, let's put it on another screen layer, and then another screen layer, and I put like a red. This is adding the colors together, so you get like green plus blue is cyan, blue plus red is magenta, and green plus red is yellow. And then all three combined are white. So you might recognize magenta, yellow, and cyan from your printer, which uses CMYK color, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and K stands for black. So that's additive. And that's different from traditional, which uses subtractive color. So in traditional, your color wheel consists of yellow, let's make a more warm yellow, yellow, blue, and red. So in this subtractive coloring method, strengthen additive. What it means is that when you put colors on top of each other, they actually darken. So this is this is additive, this is subtractive. And this is how all the paints and the inks work. They're all subtractive. And so blue and red give you like purple. It's not showing up in this because of the way I chose the colors. They're a bit on the dark side for this. If I raise the value a bit, it should help. Make it a bit less saturated. But yeah, blue and red get you purple, yellow and red get you orange, and yellow and blue get you green. So this is subtractive, and this is kind of how, if you're a traditional painter, you learn to paint, but additive is actually how we see. We see in RGB. And computer screens work in RGB, and so light basically behaves like this. So if you learn subtractive color, it's good for using traditional media. But if you learn additive color, it's good because you learn about the way light works. And it's kind of similar. Like both of them, I feel, are pretty similar in that you're mixing colors. For instance, if you're working subtractively, you have to learn about, well, what color plus what color equals what color, right? Like, oh, if I want to get this purple, well, I have to mix a bit of red and a bit of blue, and then I get this purple, maybe I have to add a bit of white. And so, because additive color is the way we actually see, it's quite intuitive once you understand it, but it takes a little bit to get used to. You've got to kind of overcome a bit of a learning curve. So let's just get rid of all that, and I'll talk a bit about how this works. Now there was a really popular tutorial way back when on conceptart.org by a guy named Linran, and this was basically how I learned about how to use RGB sliders. So that's a very good tutorial still, but it's not in video format, and again, it's kind of harder to find, I imagine. I bet you can search it pretty easily on Google, but for people who want something maybe explained to them a bit better, I'll just go ahead and do that. So I'll be using this, but I guess it's more clear if I use the cooler sliders because they're bigger. So it's the same thing. I'll just leave this open and I'll move these ones because they're just bigger and easier to see. So the first thing to know about the sliders, you get R, G, and B. You get these sliders. First thing to know is that the left side, so this side, is dark, and the right side is light. Now, that's not always true, but it's true when all these slider paddles, I guess you can call them, are aligned. So if they're all aligned and they're all at the very far end, actually I should make specific little paddles. Green and blue. So if all these paddles are here at this end, it's going to be black. You get black. And basically what you're actually saying is there is no red here, there is no green here, and there is no blue here. Whereas on this end, so this end is like 0%. This end is 100%. So if we have, wait, which one is this? Oh, God damn it. Okay, if we have all the red and we have we have all the blue, and where's the green? Come on, you gotta be here somewhere. There you are. And we have all the green, completely pointless. Then it's white. So you can see I painted white and it's showing up so well on this white background. So let's just give ourselves a like grayer background so we can see better. All right, and I'll label these blue, green, red. Okay, the other thing to notice is that whenever these three sliders, oops, oh, come on. Whenever these three sliders are lined up straight, like in a row, see how they're in a row right now? You're gonna get some form of, I'm just gonna do it here. It's easier here. Sorry about this. You're gonna get some form of gray or a desaturated value. So here, I've lined them all up, and depending on how how close they are to this side or this side, they're gonna be lighter or darker. Like if they were all right in the middle, here you'd get 50% gray if they're all aligned. So here, it's close enough. Yeah, pretty much in the middle, it's all gray. So that's the really important thing to understand, is when all these are aligned, it's desaturated. Very important. And that's because you might be looking at red, green, and blue, and it's like, how do I make gray? I want to make gray. It's like, oh, just make sure there are equal amounts of red, green, and blue, and then depending on your value, if you want it dark, move it towards the left. If you want it light, move it towards the right. Okay, so that's pretty simple, right? Like if I want a light gray, I just make sure these are all aligned, and I have a light gray, like so. Okay. All right, now what about the colors themselves? Well, let's start with the easiest ones. So we'll start with 0% of green, red, and blue. So again, it's all on the left side. How do I get red? Well, there's kind of a hint given to you, but it's also pretty obvious, right? Like if you want red, you want to get 100% of red, you take the red slider and you pull it to the right as far as it goes, and you have 100% red. Okay. So the other way that gives you a hint is that you'll notice on this slider right now, when they're all at black, you have red, green, and blue. Now, what is important to know is the colors that are showing here are not the colors that you're picking. The colors that are showing are telling you what the color will be if you move the slider there. So with red, it's basically giving you, with the red slider, it's letting you know, if you move this red slider to the right, you will get this red. If you move this green slider to the right, you'll get this green. If you move this blue slider to the right, you'll get this blue. Provided you don't move any of the other sliders, this is what you'll get. So it's saying if you want to know what color you're going to get, it's letting you know, if you move this, it will get that. So as I move this, you'll notice what happens to the green and the blue. See, the red's not changing. The red is the same, because as I move it towards the right, it's still going to be red, because I'm still saying I want to move, like I have a lot of red. So maybe right now it's at about 75% red. But the green and the blue changed because that's updating you on what they will be if you move it. So you can see here it says that like this is yellow. So it's kind of letting me know if I move the green, I'll get a yellow. If I move the blue and not the green, I'll get this purplish color, right? And if we move it, you'll see it's turning purple. So you can actually learn what to expect with the colors just by looking at the slider, because it kind of tells you. But what's much better is to just learn this kind of by memorization, I feel. And so if I pull the red all the way to the end, I get red. If I pull the green, I get green. If I pull the blue, I get blue. If I get blue and green and I add those, I get cyan. If I get red and green, I get yellow. And if I get blue and red, I get magenta. So that's really important to know. The other thing that's important is to know that, okay, if all three of these sliders are aligned, you'll get gray. But if any two of them are at 100% and one is at 0%, or, okay, if one or two of them are at 100% and one is at 0%, doesn't matter which one, so let's say these two are at 100%, this one's at 0%, you're going to have the most saturated value. If you have two at 0%, you'll also have the most saturated value. So you can have one at full value and it'll be the most saturated. You can have two and it'll be the most saturated, and it doesn't matter which two, because on the ends of the color, you have these points of like saturation. So, you know, you have your yellow super saturated, you have red, which is super saturated, you have your magenta, you have blue, and you have green. There's a bunch of other colors as well, but it's important to know that, just because if you want to increase saturation, how do you do it? Well, you can either move them further apart, like move one further apart. So let's say I want a green and I want it more saturated because it's kind of dull. Okay, so this is kind of a dull green. If I want to saturate it more, I can move the green and add it. So I'm adding green, and then it's getting more saturated. It's also getting more bright. So how do I make a saturated but dark green? So here I have a green. I want it to be saturated, but I want it to be dark. So remember how I said when they're all lined up, it gets gray. Well, the closer they are to each other, the more gray you're going to get. So the more desaturated you're going to get. So if I want this to be more saturated, but I don't want to, I want it to be dark, then I have to get rid of other colors. So right now I have a bit of red, a little bit more green, and a bit of blue. All right, so get rid of some of the red, get rid of some of the blue. Now you have green and it's dark. So now I have this darker green. If I want the green to be darker, I just go darker and I get the green. And this is one of those things that it's really good to experiment with. It helps to play with it a bit, because then you just start to understand it more intuitively. Okay, but why go to all this trouble? Why don't we just use like a color wheel? Which actually there's no reason why you shouldn't use a color wheel. Color wheels are fine. Again, here I'm using a Coloris wheel, which just basically gives you like a painter style wheel for Photoshop. There are other color wheels as well. But the reason why this is really useful is because when you want to mix certain colors, it's much easier when you're using three values. And if you can learn, or not three values, three colors, if you can learn how to mix them, it's very effective. So if I was using traditional paint and I had red, green, or red, yellow, and blue, and I wanted to learn how to mix the colors, that would be really useful to learn, like, oh, how do I mix colors? I mean, it's not going to work perfectly, but I can kind of, you know, get some red and get some blue, and here's some yellow. All right, and it's like, well, I want to mix some red, or some yellow and a bit of red, and then, oh, I'm getting this kind of orangey color, and what if I add a bit of blue to that? Well, okay, it turns a bit purpley, and then what if I add a bit of blue to that? And you kind of mix, and oh, okay, I darken the orange, but also kind of desaturated it, and you can learn about color that way. So with RGB, it helps, because then you're learning how to mix the colors. And because you're mixing them with light, they tend to be a lot more accurate, because you ask yourself one of three questions with a color, or you could add a fourth one. So the three questions you ask yourself, or you learn to ask yourself when you're mixing colors are, does this need to be more or less red? Does this need to be more or less green? Does this need to be more or less blue? That's it. That's like, what color do you have, and does it need to be more or less of a color? Another reason I like it is because when you start using these, first of all, you tend to not go crazy, like, or at least I don't. I don't go crazy with like the sliders on this huge, like moving one all the way over here and then moving the other one all the way over here. The way I actually use it is very subtle. Like, I tend to have a color that's more in the grays. I kind of look at that, okay, and then I'll think like, well, it needs a little less blue and a little more red, and then I get that color. And then you might think, well, it needs a little more green, which is going to make it a bit more yellow, and then you get that. And you see how these colors are very close to each other? So by tweaking the reds, greens, and blues, you can get very subtle color transitions, but none of these look dead. They don't look like, when you open this, and this is how often people start with color, they start working on this, and it's way too big of a field. Plus, it's only dealing with one hue at a time. So what I mean by that is everything here is pretty much this orangey color. It's just lighter or darker, more or less saturated. And then here, it's like all greenish. So what people, especially beginners, tend to do is, first of all, they favor things way too saturated. So they'll get something like this, green. All right. And then if they want a shadow of that, they might just go, okay, I go down and darker and maybe like that. And then they make a shadow like that. And that's kind of ugly, I feel. And it doesn't really change the hue at all. So you end up with pretty dead colors because they're just not, they're not exciting like this. Plus, with these, they're kind of hard to get because what you would be doing is you're kind of getting like a tone, maybe like this. Oops. Maybe like this. And then to change it, you'd have to go in here, you'd have to alter the hue, and then maybe alter the value a bit and the saturation, and then get that. But you're making like really small changes, and it takes kind of a long time rather than just like, oh, take this, I want it to be a lot cooler, a bit darker, and more blue. Okay, so I want it to be a bit darker. So the way to make something dark is we just, see how these sliders are lined up? You can see there's like a little pattern here. They're like stair steps right now, you know? You go, there's less blue, a bit more green, a bit more red. Okay, so if I just copy that pattern, so less blue, a bit more green, a bit more red, then I'll darken the value, but I'll keep the color working well, and it's not going to be dead. So if I look at this green, for instance, and I put this down, and I look at the slider configuration, you've got like very little red, a ton of green, and a little bit of blue. If I want to darken this, I get rid of the red, I get rid of the blue, or a bit less red, a bit less blue, and a bit less green. And now I've got like a darker color, but it's vibrant and it works, and it feels like, well, that's what the color should have turned into. Darken it again, a bit less red, a bit less blue, a bit less green. And now you'll notice that there is no more red to get rid of. So if we have to darken it, we have to get a bit less blue and a bit less green. And a bit less blue, a bit less green. Now we're at no blue, less green. And now we can just move the green down. And you can see how nice of a transition that is from like the greens. It's like, oh, that's a very pleasant transition. All the colors are very rich and they work well together. So that's very, very good. And it's a very helpful technique to know that, well, if you have this pattern, so the sliders in a certain configuration, so right now you can see here, there's like that thing, where you've got like red here, I'll just use black for it, let's do that. Okay, you've got the reds here, the green about here, and the blue about here. So if I take this pattern and I just move it up or down, it's going, as long as I keep them the same distance apart, it's going to get darker, but it's going to be the same, like it's going to be a really nice transition. So I mean, we can try that here. Okay, so I'm going to move it up this time. So that, and that, get that, that, and that, get that, and that, and get that. So that's really useful, very effective, very, very nice. But this actually can be even better. And the reason is that because you're controlling how much you want to add, you can warm and cool your colors very easily. So with warmer cool colors, they tend to have more red to them. So reds are warm and blues are cool. Now you can have cool blues and warm blues, cool reds and warm reds. You can have greens that are cooling things down, but in general, you can think of it this way. If you want to have warm things, you add more red. You want to cool them down, you add more blue and a bit less red. So, or you can move them closer together. So for instance, a warm blue, this is a very warm blue. A cool blue, this is very cool. However, this is the coldest you're going to get. White is the coldest. Okay, so if I want to have a cooler blue and I have this, what I have to do is actually add a bit of red to it, and then it's going to cool down. Because actually a very saturated color, anything on this ring is a warm. It's like the warm version of that color. It's a very saturated version. But if I lower the saturation, then all the colors are going to be cooled down. So there's something I'd like to do in painting, and I got this from Richard Schmidt, who's a very, very great artist, and it's in his book, it's in his book Alla Prima, but it's also something a lot of people use, which is basically you have warm shadows and cool highlights. Now, the reason you would do this in traditional, and he's an oil painter, the reason you would do this in traditional is because white is cold. This is very cold. And black, in traditional anyway, is pretty warm, especially if it's like you're using traditional paint. It's often like well, black tends to be a blue, actually, but if you add some red, it can be considered very warm. So when you add white to a thing, that's how you lighten colors most of the time. You're adding white. So you're cooling them down. So if you use a lighting scheme like North Light, you automatically get colder highlights and warmer shadows. But what I've noticed just from observation is that it tends to often be the shadows are warm. I can't really see things where there are cool shadows. I know people say there are times when the shadows are cool, but they still seem warm to me. Especially when they get very dark. When I look into like any dark area, it feels warm. And also when you close your eyes, because there's I guess because there's blood vessels in your eyelids, you still get a warmth. There's like a warm dark, not a cool dark. So for that reason, I always prefer this warm shadows, cool highlights, but you can also do it the other way. You can have cool shadows and warm highlights. But where am I getting at with this? Basically, okay, I mentioned there was a pattern, right? So let's say this was the color that I was going to pick. And there's a pattern here. So if I increase them all by the same amount, I'm going to get a variation on that color. And you get used to just moving your hand like the same amount. So it's when I move these, I'm less measuring with my eyes. Like I'm not really looking at the pattern as much as I'm moving it ever so slightly. So I know I moved that a little bit. So I move my finger or my wrist, I guess, or elbow or my arm in general, the same amount. And now I get this really nice gradation. But what I can also do is I can say, well, I want the lights to be cooler. So then what I can do is I'm going to be moving these, and I'll move them the same amount. Like I'll move a bit of red, a bit of green, a bit of blue. Let's try that again. I added a bit too much green. A bit of red, a bit of green, a bit of blue, but I'll add a bit more blue. And I get that. Okay, we'll do the same thing. Add a bit more blue each time as I increase the colors, and now it's getting cooler as we get down to this end. And then we can do it the opposite, where I'm going to go down and I'll move them all about the same, except I'll add even more, I'll keep even more red. So move it down, down, and then down, but add a bit more red. Okay, so we're getting darker, but we're also getting warmer. So when I remove the blue and the green, I remove the red as well, but less red. And now I've got this transition. And like this is a very nice and pleasant gradient. But this one is also very nice and pleasant. And he's got more variation to him. Or she got more variation. So this is kind of more like what my painting palette would look like. And I suppose it could look like this as well. Like they're both fine, but this is what I prefer to use because then I've got that warm and cool transition. And you'll notice how nice they would, like these would all be very nice as skin tones. And indeed, using RGB sliders is really good for skin tones. And what you end up learning is kind of what flesh is as a tone. So what I've discovered from doing studies is that when you deal with flesh, you have a ratio where you have more red and then less green and then even less blue. All right, so let's just try that out. Let's add some red. And then let's have less green, quite a bit less, and even less blue. Okay, there we go. Let's darken that. So here's some red, less green, even less blue. Oh, well, they're always nice skin tones. I mean, you can have, of course, variety, but they give you, like, just that. Doesn't matter if I go light or dark, I end up with sort of the different tones in flesh. And it's like, okay, let's say a person has dark skin. I still do the same thing. I have more red, less green, and a bit less blue. But if you say, well, okay, maybe his skin is a bit more olive-like, well, you just add a bit of green, and then there you go. You add a bit more, and like these are very subtle transitions, but that's what you want when you deal with skin anyway. So for me, as a painter who, I mean, I don't paint all the time anymore, but as someone who, when I do paint, I like to paint faces, this is really useful because you easily get skin tones down and you can have a lot of variety without having to get lost in this thing, which is super confusing when it's like, okay, I want some, like, let's say this is my skin tone. Okay, now I want to darken it. Okay. Like, I kind of know how to do it just because I've done it, which is, oh, I'd darken it, I'd warm it, and I'd move it in a diagonal down like that. But I do feel like this is kind of easier to just shift, like, darker and then keep a bit more red. It's like, all right, we pretty much get the same thing. So, yeah, that's basically it. I figured I would try to do a demo for you, and you can kind of see how I use the sliders, but the lesson is pretty much over. So You know, you don't have to stick around for the demo if you want. You can just quit here. But if you want to see me actually try and use this and sort of show you how I go about doing it, I figured I would try. All right, so I got a couple of references. I got this one and I got this one. I wasn't exactly sure which one to do. Just gonna be doing like a study. I like the older skin because it has a lot of variation here. It's like all these little value shifts. But this one's good too. Let's just use this one. It's got lots of variation as well. All right, so I'm gonna do a quick study of this, and hopefully it will give you an idea of, you know, how I go about using color sliders. So the first thing I do, this is pretty common for me, is I shrink the image when I want to do a photo study, because I want to get the big picture stuff. I don't want to be focusing on any little details. So the first thing I'll do whenever I paint and I've got to start is I don't want to be starting on, like if I'm going straight into color, I don't want to start on white. For sure, I don't want to start on white. I might want to start, like if I'm doing it grayscale, I might want to start with gray. But the reason I don't want to start with white is because white is all the way over here. And so how far is that from black? That's really far from black. How far is it from, you know, like a dark anything? It's pretty far. Whereas if I start in a medium gray, it's about equal distance from the dark to the light, so you're not moving that much. So your eyes are more likely to see correct value if you're using kind of like an average color. And when I color, I actually want to pick an average that is sort of close to the skin tone. So when I look at this person, I see basically what I said. I see like red in the face, so I'm going to add some red, but I also see some like blue and green. So I'm going to look at the colors and try and find the right color. Now this takes a while to learn how to do it, and I haven't practiced in a while, so I'm rusty as well. But the point is, you have to let yourself suck for a while, because it is kind of finicky at first, but it does get easier. So I'm going to start with this color, and it might be completely off. It's all right. It's all right. Maybe a bit darker. And then I'll add like the highlights. A bit less red. Okay, that's kind of like the forehead here, which is what I was getting, that shadow on the forehead. And I can kind of block in this shape. So basically, when I look at this picture, what I see is like this upside down T shape of the head, and then the shoulders, and then there's like a face in here. All right, so then I see a bunch of dark in the background, especially when I squint. So I might get that in, and I see it as having a bit of blue in it. And it's really tiny right now, so I can't see any details, but that's fine. I see it as having a bit of red, a bit of blue, and less green. All right, so something like that. Actually, I can just block in this whole thing, because when I squint, the values all kind of mix together. And okay, so that's a starting point for this. And now that I add the dark, I feel like I've gone way too light with the skin, but that's okay. Everything's gonna be adjusted, so it's fine. And the downside to this technique is it's much slower. Like I can paint much faster if I don't use this technique, but the skin tones don't look as nice. So there's also like a bit of light from the ears kind of popping out. And then there's a bit of dark for the hair. Kind of makes like this shape and goes down and makes this shape. All right, I'm gonna zoom in now. And that's our starting point. So I feel like I need to widen the forehead a bit. And now I'm just looking at like shapes and stuff. This is just drawing, so maybe this is boring or whatnot, but I don't know. That's how to start. And figure I'd show you a demo where I'm not really time-lapsing or anything, so that you know, if you didn't want to see it, there's nothing stopping you from just not. Okay, so there we go. Now for the hair, it's quite saturated. So I know that these colors are going to be far apart, but you'll notice that when I make them far apart, they're like this far apart. They're not, nothing's like that crazy, right? So you get used to adding bits of color and not like a bit of red, a bit of blue, and you're working more in these very subtle shifts of color where you're not really doing a whole lot of changing. You're just making slight adjustments, and this is going to get like much more realistic colors because that's how they work anyway. They're not all over the place. All right, so here it gets a bit darker and a bit cooler. So when I want to cool something and I want to darken it, I'll get rid of some of the green and some of the red, but I won't get rid of as much blue. But if the whole thing needs to be darkened, then I need to kind of move them all quite a bit. So this part is darker, and I'm just going to kind of block in a few of the shapes. There's tons of different ways of painting. The way I'm doing it right now is just one method. It's not to say this is the best or that you should use this. It's just kind of what I'm using right now. And just trying to block in like the features, like the nose kind of here, then the mouth is down here, and then you've got like a shadow, but the shadow is very yellowish. So a lot of green, a lot of red gets you yellow, and less blue. Okay, so maybe something like that. Yeah. All right, and then underneath the neck, it's cooler. So it's more like a gray. And this is something I noticed from painting in general, is that when you have highlights, they're often grayed out. And this kind of is the opposite of what a lot of people do, which is they'll make their shadows very grayed out, and they'll make their lights very intense and vibrant, as if that's how it works. But it doesn't usually. It's usually the opposite. Okay, now I need to make this area of value behind her hair. So I'm going to put in this and put it here as well, because it's really bright. There's a bit here too, but that's quite bright, and it goes even brighter here. And some here, and some here, and then we get this hair color, but a lot brighter as well, all around the edge as it kind of transitions. So it might look weird at first, but when you put enough of the colors that you see in, it starts to transition more, and it doesn't look so weird. So there's some of that, and then down here it gets a bit more orangey. So we can go ahead and add some of that. All right, so once I get a bunch of color down, then it's easier to just kind of sample from within the image and make slight adjustments. Like, well, you know, this value kind of, the color needs to be less red, so I just lower the red, maybe increase the green a bit. I get something like that, but that's a bit too dead, so I'll get rid of some of the blue and maybe increase the red a touch. Yeah, it's a bit better. Again, using very, very tiny little movements. I don't want to go big and crazy here. I just want to have like the subtle transitions as I see them. The proportions aren't perfect, but I figure if I spend a ton of time on this. It's probably going to be like 15 hours. So I don't want to spend 15 hours painting. So I'm going to give you kind of an idea of how I approach things, but not necessarily go all the way. I'll still probably end up with like a fairly rough sketch of a face, but you should get at least a bit of an understanding of kind of how I'm using the tools and, you know, the pitfalls or the areas to watch out for, like the, you know, keeping things subtle. Like that took me a while to learn, so I mean, I'm hoping it is easier for you because you have someone to tell you that don't do that. Make sure you're not jumping around too much. And here it gets quite a bit darker, but still fairly saturated. And sometimes your colors aren't going to be perfect, but it's okay because you don't necessarily have to copy the photo. And this is a photo study, so even when I'm doing stuff from imagination, I can remember stuff. Like I can remember, well, I have a skin tone, and I know in the highlights it gets a bit cooler. Okay, so when I go for picking a color for the highlights, I can kind of more easily guess what would be an appropriate color. So here, kind of picking that, I see quite a big highlight on the nose, and then on the tip of the nose, and then here. And if I think about the shadow shapes that I see, actually get kind of dark here, here, and comes around. This is all in shadow. This is in shadow. This comes down in shadow. This goes in, it blends in with that, and that gets very much more saturated. So I'll pick this. I see more red and more orange in it, so I'm gonna lower the blue by quite a bit, but make sure there's quite a bit of red in there. And something that's actually too bright. Yeah, something a bit like that. And then I can use the color I already have and kind of mix into that to get this warmth. Now this is overdone, but it's better to, like, if I overdo it, it'll still look nice. It'll just be more like, well, that's the statement I see. I'm saying I see it warm, so I'm going to make it even warmer than what I necessarily see. But now that I put this in, the neck seems like it's too blue. It needs a bit more green, so I'll add a bit more yellow in there. Not move any of the blue and not move any of the red. And that's kind of basically all you're doing. You're picking something and it's like, well, this is too cool, for instance. It needs to be warmer. So get rid of some of the blue, add some green, add some red, and there we go. Now that's warmer. All right, and then here, she's got kind of orange cheeks, like where they're blushing, they're orange. You might see that. All right, so let's take this, and to make orange, you add red and green. Get rid of blue, but a bit more red. And yeah, something like that. So you start building that. And right here, it's about the same, but then it gets darker. So we want to darken it. So, just keep the sliders the same distance apart, but I'm going to warm it a bit more. So I'll keep the red, like when I adjust them, I adjust the red just a bit, but the others a bit more. And now I have a darker version of that color. Okay, and then it gets, like the shadow actually comes down here and it goes into this lip. And then this part of the face is in shadow. Yeah, I probably should have thought more about the light and shadow in the beginning, but I can focus on that here as well. So it gets a bit cool in this crease of the eye. So that means a bit more blue. And the colors are probably going to be closer to each other, so more gray-like. And then I guess I can get in the eyebrows a little bit. So they're sort of a greenish color, the way I see it, like a greenish brown. So that means a bit of, I'm going to desaturate it a bit and have a bit more green in it. And they have a very particular shape. So I'll try and get that. And the value is somewhat similar on both sides. And it kind of end in like this pointy thing. Yeah, very pointy. Quite an interesting shaped eyebrow, actually. And then you have a bit of highlight as the eye goes under. And I'm actually, like, I haven't painted the eyes yet. I'm just dealing with the eye socket more than anything because I want to get a sense of where that eye is, like how to place the eye. So I'm actually painting everything except the eye, and you know, should leave a spot that is eye-sized. All right, so this part comes out quite a bit. Comes down, blush goes out. Now I'm really hoping my proportions aren't completely off, but they could be. So you probably should flip and flip. And okay, so this gives me kind of a refresher of what I'm looking at. All right, so this kind of blends pretty smoothly. So here I can just kind of color pick with Alt and blend those. The ear is quite interesting, and as a shape, it goes higher than the eyebrow, and it goes down, and very interesting shape. So I've got to capture that. Okay, and there's a shadow inside, and when I look at the shadow, it's kind of like the same as the hair. Let's just add a bit of darkness because it's not dark enough. We're not at black, and I don't really want to go to black, and even if there is black, I see in the photo. In photos, you tend to get black much more than you do in real life. In real life, you get very saturated darks, and in photos, it gets black and dead. And that's kind of how you can tell, you know, if someone's just copying a photo, they often have a lot of blacks in their image. Whereas if they're, or if they're like copying film, you know, stuff that's taken with a camera, you'll get more blacks. Whereas when you're actually looking at things, if you paint from life, you get less black and more, as I said, saturated dark tones. All right, so we've got like this greenish little rim that comes all the way around. Cheek goes out, and then you got this interesting shape for the chin as it goes around. So very interesting stuff here. Very unique face. All right, so this needs to be lightened a bit and desaturated. So I took a desaturated tone from her neck and I just kind of went over so I could bring those closer. Again, if I really wanted to take my time, I would perhaps, you know, try and match it perfectly. And that's kind of a fun exercise you can do as well. You know, if you want to play a game, you can try and find a friend and try and color match, see who can get the colors best, I guess. All right. So we got a lot missing in terms of the features. Probably should get those in. So here's the eye, kind of goes down and up. Very interesting shape. I'm looking at this negative shape right now, and then you get this going down, and then this part of the eye is very inside the eye socket. You can see the, I don't know what to call it, but the meatiness of this area, very meaty. And you also get this little spot that's really nice of light, which is hitting right here. And it's like this yellowish light. So we want less blue, and maybe just less blue and a bit less green. And yeah, that's about right. And then when I squint, this is much darker. So what I need to do is I'll just copy the pattern I see. And there, got a much darker tone here. Now I'm trying to remember to use as big a brush as I need to. So I don't want to use small brushes. I want to use bigger brushes and make more deliberate, larger strokes. That's going to look better. And with that, I can work on the form more in terms of getting like nicer strokes. So because I don't paint too often, I get pretty not confident, and so I'm more likely to use smaller brush strokes than I need to, as opposed to like more confident big brush strokes. And that's because I know that I have to remember that, okay, I have a tendency to do this, so I have to make sure I don't. Okay, so around the eye, it actually is a lot cooler, a lot more purpley. So let's add a bit. Actually, we'll get rid of all of them, but keep a bit more blue. And okay, so that's a bit too desaturated. So maybe a bit more red. Yeah, it's a bit better. And then it gets quite light, actually, in the crease of the eye. Not way lighter, like not white. So nowhere near white, but it does get lighter. So there's like that little highlight there. I want to get that in, and there's one on the opposite side, which is close to the same value. And then the nose has like this orangey flavor to it, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to look around and see, like, is there a similar color? So I've got the shadow on the nose. And yeah, I mean, I can find a shadow color on the side of her face, which is pretty much the same. And then there's that. And probably the hair has some of that tone. And here we can get some of that. So I'm kind of thinking of it as if I was painting and just like picking colors from the palette that already exists. I see there's like this blockiness to the nose, so I want to get that. Like I want to treat this kind of like it's a block with a bit of a highlight on it. And the highlight could be a bit more yellowish and maybe a bit more blue as well. And it's got like a specific shape. And the shape of the highlight determines the shape of the form. So how that form feels changes depending on how you put the highlight. Now it's very important to know if you're working on pretty much anything, is that pay special attention to the speculars, because they're going to determine how the form looks. So we get that in, and let's get the eyes in. So the eyes, looking at the eyes, it's pretty deceiving, because you see them and it's like, well, that's white, but it's not really. If I squint, it's about this, just a bit lighter than perhaps this area of the skin. So I'm going to select this area so I get a general idea. Okay, so I want something that's less saturated but around this value. A bit lighter. So maybe this. Let's put it down and see, and then evaluate. Okay, so something to note about eyes in general is if a person is young and healthy, again, this is something I learned from Alla Prima, Richard Schmid's book, they have a bit more blue in their eye. So I'm going to add a bit more blue, and that should give a much closer color. Yeah, let's get rid of some of the red. Yeah, it's getting closer. All right, so now for the pupil area and the iris, what I'm doing is I'm not painting the pupil and the iris. I'm just painting the white of the eye, and I'm going to leave the space for where the pupil goes, and that's going to make it easier for me to capture that shape. So I'm only painting in the white of the eye, not the pupil. Because when we see pupils, we're more likely to just like put in a circle, or the iris. And if you look at this eye, it's not at all a circle. If anything, it's more like a rectangle than a circle. Okay, so here, let's make that a bit brighter. Here it gets brighter, and then here it gets brighter. And that's going to make it feel more like a rounded shape for the eye. So that's good. All right. just tapping to make my brush bigger. I'm gonna add a bit of a transition here. And let's see. Okay, so I see a bit of a more dark and saturated color. So get rid of a bit of the green and a bit of the blue. Get a bit of a shadow in there. Okay, and then there's also a shadow off the nose, which, this cast shadow, you might see it, which is fairly cool. Like, cool as in a cool color. So I'll get the shape in, but I know it gets lighter as we go outside, so then I'll just use the skin and kind of fade. So I've got the shape, but I also fade it out. Right? So there, I got kind of like a shadow there. These transitions are no good. They're too stark, so I have to darken them. And this needs to be a lot darker in the shadow side. But I still want it to be fairly saturated. Maybe something like this. Let's test it. Yeah, that's okay. Just blend that a bit. And for the lips. Well, actually, I could put in the eyes. So the eyes are like green eyes. But when you think of green, if I was doing this, the tendency would be to go here and then say, well, they're green, they're fairly light, maybe do something like this and get something like that. But that's not at all what I see. In fact, when I look at it, it looks a lot more gray than anything. So let's just zoom in and see. These eyes are much grayer than green. So like if I just select, okay, here's a green, like green, here's what it is. See how gray that is? Like, fine, okay, it's still in the greens, but it's super grayed out. And it goes from like blue into yellow, but it's always gray. It's very gray, very gray. All right, so knowing that, and I mean, after you do it for a while, you kind of learn that blue eyes are actually like grayish eyes that are lighter and a little bit blue, and green eyes are often sometimes grayish and green, or like brownish and green. They're usually not super green. Sometimes they do look that way. Those are very exciting opportunities for painters if you can see, you know, oh wow, the eyes really are quite saturated. But in general, they're not. And this also helps when you're drawing and painting from imagination, that you don't want to, you know, pick a green that is, you know, just pure green, because it's not going to look right. So for the dark in the eye, I know I want it very dark, but as I said, I'm going to keep it a little bit intense in terms of color. So I'm actually going to almost reduce all the green and all the blue, but I'll keep a bit of red. And that's going to ensure that this color is vibrant. It's not a dead black color. And, you know, people say, like, don't use black. I think one of the reasons is because black tends to, if you use black in its pure form, because it's a blue, it tends to cool down things. And it also, because you're cooling down things, you're disrupting the warm and cool balance that you have in your image. So you don't want to do that. And here, let's just give some eyelashes. So it's better to use a dark. And then when it comes to digital painting, it's actually even more important, I think, not to use black, because when you use black, what happens is basically what you're saying is the screen is off. Like if it's pure black, you're saying there's no light coming from the screen, like something like this. And that can be very dead as a color. So it's better in a way to have a bit of life in that and just have it dark, but not necessarily black. And here I have to darken these values quite a bit. They're way too bright in general. But again, this is, this is part of it. Now, with hair, it's very important at the hairline to keep this soft, nice and soft. Because what happens is the hair, there's like tons of little strands of hair, right? But they're all growing out of the skin. So it's, even if hair itself is not super soft, when you see a bunch of little things and they're all kind of growing out, it's gonna be softer. And you can even see the hair here is, the skin is rather showing, but it's a bit lighter and a bit cooler because it's not getting as much sun. It's not getting tanned quite so much. So by keeping this softer, and actually here it gets quite yellow, quite vividly yellow. So I'm gonna add a bit of red and green and have some of that, maybe a bit more red, a bit more green. I can get some nice yellows in there. Again, I'm allowing things to be pushed a bit because it's going to look nicer. Or in my view, it's going to look nicer. Maybe in someone else's view, it's going to look worse. And then I'm going to get some, there are some almost whites in here. And they're like here in the hair. There's like parts here. And the reason I'm getting in some of these much brighter whites now is because I want to be able to evaluate the image in a better way in terms of values. And if I don't have my full value range here, what's going to happen is I'll be misjudging the colors. I'll be painting things either too light or too dark, or often if you don't have your darks in there, you end up painting in a very washed out way. So you see a lot more saturated color in this area. So I'm going to pick this and I'm going to get rid of almost all the blue and a lot of the green so that I'm painting with pretty colorful colors. And this is another part, like sometimes you want to have things grayed out, but sometimes you want to have things colorful. But even though this is, colorful as I'm painting it, I feel like this is very colorful, very vibrant. It's actually not that, it's not super, like this isn't yellow, right? This is, you can still see how far that is from a purely saturated one. Not that it's wrong, not that maybe there is pure saturated stuff here, but it's more subtle. And all right, so this nose is quite off in terms of shape, especially because of the nostril. So I'd have to adjust that. I'd probably be adjusting this for quite a while. Get some of that shadow, but warm it up a bit. All right, so now I'm gonna try and get some of this mouth, and starting with the highlights of this philtrum, I think it's called the philtrum, part at the end of the nose. And I'm gonna go into the reds. So the reds in this mouth are very not that red. I think this is too bright, but let's put it down. It's a little bit too bright, but not much too bright. So got something like this. Get like that. This part should be brought in, so I just put that line so I'll remember, okay, that needs to be brought in. Now I can look at the eye and kind of get a sense of where the mouth is. It's kind of like ends here. And then you've got this shape, like a upside down triangle shape, or I guess it's still just a triangle. And then you've got a lip that's fairly big on the bottom. So the reason I'm using like brushy strokes is because I'm still kind of insecure. And I kind of want to just draw that in because I didn't start with a proper drawing. So because of that, because I didn't want to spend way too much time, because otherwise I'd just be, I'd have to get a really good drawing, very tight, and then talk about all the little RGB color things, and that would take way too long, and I also didn't want to just, you know, time-lapse my way through, because then I feel like, well, for myself, when I see time-lapse video, it's fine, there's a place for it for sure, but sometimes it feels like, oh, I feel like I missed something, and I don't want you to feel like you missed something. All right. So now we've kind of got the mouth shape, but we have none of the colors. So squinting down, I actually see a pretty dark value in the mouth. I'm just gonna kind of fudge the hair because like there's a lot going on. Don't have time to show all of it, so just gonna indicate now. You know, there's a bit of orange here. Can probably intensify that and give this kind of blooming light effect. And here, let's get dark, maybe some reds. Let's make that feel more lively. But yeah, back to the mouth itself. There's a lot of dark in there. When I look at the teeth, if I squint, I don't even see teeth. But if I don't squint, I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not draw any teeth and just have a big black, well, it's actually a dark brown. A dark brown thing. And then I'm going to compare the teeth to this and like, okay, how much lighter is it? Well, it's a bit more yellowish and a bit brighter. And so just add like that. It's like, okay, that's kind of close, maybe a bit less blue. Sure. And then the highlights are a bit more intense, so let's add some of that. And yeah, it's kind of close. Maybe a bit more light, but not crazy light. So yeah, I mean, you see that tooth, that tooth, and then there's one there. So it's a bit on the subtle side, but what I want to do is actually increase the amount of red in the mouth. And these are just like little tricks you can do, is by adding red in the mouth and red in the nostrils and stuff, it feels more like skin, and like, oh, we know the mouths are warm, so it gives that feeling. Okay, let's get the highlights in the eye. Yeah, I keep being tempted to use the color wheel. Okay, so there's like highlight here and highlight here. I'm just gonna give a bit of life, and then let's work on this lip. So the under part of the lip is a lot more saturated and a lot darker. So I didn't need to move the red so much, but I did need to move the green and the blue down. And I have to go even darker, so I have to reduce more green, more blue, maybe a bit less red, because it's not super saturated. And try that. Yeah, it's kind of close. All right, and then for the highlight, it's kind of a gray, as usual, you know, most highlights are gray, grayed out. And there's clearly the little split down the middle where the two, like there's two pieces in the bottom lip, and there's three in the top, two like meat chunks. Okay, so let's add a bit more and a bit lighter here. That just kind of fades off into the skin, and then you get quite a bright little area here. And then you get a bit of shadow under the lip, which is actually quite dark. Let's put that in. So I just got these photos from like a royalty-free thing. I just searched Google and search for, I think, reuse with modification as a license type. Like you can go into the settings and find something like that. So you can probably find this image yourself if you wanted to give it a go, or I could post a link in the description to it in case you wanted to try as well. I don't know. All right, so here, just gonna try and wrap up soon. Maybe give myself at most another 15 minutes, because I don't want to drag on too long, but I think you get the idea, right? How to use this. It's just a matter of time, just more, let's flip it, more time spent on little things. You know, you get the ear, you get the shape, the shadow shape here. You'd have to adjust those colors, of course. They're a bit more red, maybe a bit of blue in there as well. With ears, as well as the nose and the mouth, often it doesn't hurt to go a bit warmer in the shadows. It's not going to look wrong. It's going to be fine. And you can always adjust this. So I'm kind of treating it now like I'm just going to get the drawing in place and less of the absolute colors, because I just don't have enough time to adjust all the colors. So instead, I'm going to get as much of the values as I can get, because those are really important. And then if I wanted to work on this more in the future, then I could just, you know, easily look at these and just ask those questions. You know, is this more red? Is it more green? Is it more blue? That's it. Is it more red, green, or blue? Or less, more or less, you know. Some stray hairs here, some stray hairs here. Adding a few stray hairs can do a lot in terms of making it look like you put tons of detail in. Like most of these hairs are just super quick and blocky, but if I had a few thin ones, it can start to look like, oh yeah, okay, that's detailed, and it's not really. It's just a few hairs do the trick. I'm putting them mostly on the outside, so you get the silhouette and it feels like, oh, there's a lot going on. And here too, you know, a few of these hairs. Probably, if I was spending more time, I would work a lot on the skin first and then do the hair, because the hair is on top of the skin, and it's kind of awkward if you do it the other way around, where you do the skin or the hair first, like I did, and then you put in the skin. So here, I put down a color. It's way too blue and way too red, so it needs a bit more green, and maybe a bit less red and blue. And then I'll put that down, and that's a bit closer, but maybe a bit too much green. So that's also a bit closer. I can kind of mix these colors and get a bit of transition value, or color and value. Both of them. And kind of build. Okay, that comes in. I've got quite a dark here for the collarbone, and it gets kind of orange as well. So I just picked some colors from the face, and then I can knock it all down fairly easily, and then you got a highlight on that. Get the anatomy right. Again, there's a highlight on that collarbone. And I mean, although this isn't perfect, and it's, you know, it's not, I'm not saying it's a great study or anything, but it is a case of, like, the skin tones are okay, you know, they do feel like skin, and that's really important, that it feels like skin. And if I wasn't using RGB color sliders, it would be way harder to get this feeling of a vibrancy in the skin. Again, it's not impossible. I'm not saying you have to use it. I'm just saying it's helpful. And if nothing else, try it. And if you don't like it, at least you've tried it, and at least you understand it, because this is the way we see light and we see color. Okay, so underneath this eye feels a little too dark. Feels a bit swollen, so let's smooth that out a bit and bring in some of this light here. So there's like a lot of anatomy stuff here. There's like the jaw, or not the jaw, the cheekbone coming around, and then you have this area with the muscles coming down from the nose. So, you know, learning your anatomy definitely helps, even when you're doing faces. Don't have enough time to go into facial anatomy, but you can look it up and study that if you haven't already. Or maybe I'll make videos of it in the future. A bit more yellow, a bit more red. Get some of that highlighted, maybe a bit more blue as well. And I can add there's a lighter highlight here that's a bit more pinky, so I added quite a bit more blue and a bit of red, so I can get this furrow in the head, because she has like an expression, and her brow is kind of like, and then I feel like the eyes are really, like, I need to move this all up. Yeah, it's quite screwed up now that I look at it. Darn it. See, if I had to take a break, then I would notice all this, and it's like, God damn it, I have to fix everything. Yeah, I'm just like inside of like, oh, I hope this doesn't look as bad as it looks to me right now, because I'm starting to see like this cascade of errors. Everything's starting to feel wrong. I have to add the upper lid, or that's not gonna, the eye's gonna look too small. And then I have to add the highlight on that upper lid, and a highlight on this part, make it a bit stronger. At least the expression is kind of coming back. And this part has a shadow in the ear. I usually spend quite a lot of time on ears and stuff, and the nose, and trying to make it right. And this lip is completely wrong in shape, so I can fix that. And she has like freckles and stuff, but that's not really, like, that's characteristic, so it will make a difference on the likeness, but it's not super important in terms of like big picture stuff. It's really stuff you would do right at the end. But I might do it just because I know I'm not going to be spending forever on this. Get some dark behind the ear. So reusing some of the colors, like I'll sometimes sample from many areas and just keep reusing it. What that does is it brings things together, and it makes it so that you can, the piece feels more cohesive, because all these colors are bouncing around anyway. So for instance, I can take some of this background and I can put it in, and actually it's a bit too blue, actually it's a bit too purple, and a bit too blue, and a bit too dead. So like it's not saturated enough. So I need to go darker, more saturated, and less purpley. Yeah, that's still not right. That's closer, but it's somewhere in between these two values, so more like that. Yeah, that's a bit better. This though, way too light. So I'm just noticing crazy errors everywhere now. They're all just popping up. And this part gets more desaturated and a bit cooler. Yeah. Something more like that, and then this lip and this part kind of combine. Get some yellows in here. Get that shadow back in. So cast shadows are generally a lot sharper than form shadows, so I'm trying to keep it a bit sharper. And the nose needs to be quite a lot darker. Kind of missed some of these shapes. Alright, so getting a bit better. I'm trying to squint more because I was not squinting enough. And again, this is, you know, because I haven't painted in a long time, so I haven't been doing the squinting enough. So when you paint a lot, you basically are always squinting, and when you start to look around, you tend to squint, and then people kind of think you're upset all the time, but really you're just a painter. All right, let's flip again. Yeah. When I look at it, the colors keep seeming off, but I have to also ask myself, like, okay, the colors are off, but is the effect there? Like, do things feel about right? Because if they do, it's not so bad. Maybe, well, here's a muddy color right here, so I want to get rid of that. And sometimes you have to resaturate colors if they get muddy. So what I mean by that is, like, pick the color and then it might be desaturated, so like get rid of some blue, and like in this case maybe some blue, maybe increase some of the yellow, and you just want to make it so it's not, you're not losing that saturation. This blue around here. This lip feels not big enough. Last time I did a photo study, I caricatured it quite a bit, and some people weren't happy about that. They thought, oh, you didn't like make it a good study because you're caricaturing it. And I think caricaturing makes for better studies personally, so I don't agree with that. But for that reason, I'm trying to make this a bit less stylized. But because I'm doing that, I'm actually making her less like herself, because some of these things that I'm missing, like the larger bottom lip, are very important to have. Because they're part of her character. They make her look like her. Let's redo that highlight. I think I didn't do a good job of it. Yeah, It's a bit, maybe not in color or value, but it's a bit better in placement. And then I gotta put in this shadow under the lip. And it's getting pretty close. There's like a stronger edge here. I want to get a stronger edge right here at the side of her face so that her face comes forward and that the neck goes back. Maybe use this just to strengthen the chin, because I need to make sure that is appropriately separated. All right. A bit more highlight on that. Kind of diminished the chin a bit too much, so should strengthen it a bit. Get some of that highlight. That highlight's not that strong, it's a bit more pinky, so I'm going to put a bit of pink from the cheeks around that chin. And chins can get quite pinkish, especially for girls. They can get quite pink. So putting that highlight here, although I'm kind of overdoing it, what it's doing is it's going to strengthen that feeling of the cheek coming forward. And because she has such prominent cheeks, that's a good thing to have. And a bit more blue for this highlight. I need to redo it. Redo that highlight and redo this highlight. And this one is now placed off, so I need to get that in correct. As I said before, like, highlights are super important where you put them, and you got to make sure they're in the right spot. And I guess that kind of time's up, so I'm just gonna add a few freckles and call it a day. At least for this painting. So if you're finding this stuff useful, I'm glad. I hope it's useful. I know it's tricky with some of the stuff, and sometimes it's hard to see. I feel like one of the things that is a constant issue that I see a lot these days is this thing of people wanting to cut corners and kind of get improvement faster. And the weird thing though is, because I've been one of those people, like, I felt like I'm way too far behind. There's no way I can spend time, figuring it out the hard way. I've got to find, I forgot the upper eyelid is going to cast a shadow on the eyeball, which is making it look weird. But yeah, people want the easy answer. But the thing is, actually, the hard way is the easy way. What I mean by that is, if you learn to do a method, like the RGB color sliders are really hard at first to get used to. But if you get used to them, actually painting goes by way faster and it's way easier. But in the beginning, it's not easy. It's hard. It sucks. But later on, when you get proficient, it actually is easier. And same with drawing. Some people, like, they want to paint, but they don't have drawing experience, and they feel like, well, I would have to spend years learning how to draw. But even though that might be true, when you finally learn how to draw, it's actually much, much faster. Whereas if you don't, and you, like, oh, maybe it takes you a couple years to improve your drawing if you really try. But if you don't, you're going to be in the same place or a similar place in those years, and it's not, I'm realizing how bad talking and painting is, but it's not good. It's not worth it. You'll be like, why did I not do this sooner? Because that's how I feel. might just, go hardcore and learn how to draw again and do more anatomy study and stuff. And it makes everything else so much easier than the easy way. So for that reason, I would encourage people to, try some techniques like this. And I said I would try the freckles. I have like a skin brush that I never use. Maybe this. Maybe this would do it. I don't know. I don't use these brushes, but I want to quickly get freckles, and I think, it does it. It does it. There, I got freckles. That was easy. All right. So, custom brushes. There we go. And there's some freckles on her chest as well. Maybe in the head as well. All right, good enough. Okay, well, it is what it is. It's not a perfect study. Sorry about that. But hopefully it showcased a bit of why I think the RGB sliders are so effective. And yeah, I hope this helped, and thanks for watching.